Phil Travis, and this week's lecture on post-war Europe relates to the social revolutions of the 1960s. Particularly, we are going to examine the emergence of the New Left, as it was called, and the protests of 1968. So the New Left refers to a really broad social movement. Um, During the 1960s and 70s, it emerged in the United States as well as it did in Europe, and it was a broad sort of social movement. It was led by students, educators, civil rights leaders, women's rights leaders, and so forth. And it very much contrasted with the activities of like the older left, the older Marxist movements, which had very much been driven more around the notion of the proletariat and of class and society. By contrast, the New Left was much more driven by social issues, issues like civil rights, issues of freedom in society, issues of fulfillment in society, issues of sexual freedom in society, opposition to nuclear weapons, civil rights, women's rights, sexual rights. It was really a movement driven most by social issues rather than the sort of old leftist movements that were driven more by class and class inequality. In the picture here, we see historian E.P. Thompson at a 1980s nuclear weapons protest. E.P. Thompson was one of the founders of the New Left. In 1963, he published The Making of the English Working Class, which is one of the most important examples of like Marxist history that there is. And if you take a graduate level historiography class, you'll almost certainly still be assigned to at least consider or examine E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. Thompson also became the editor of The New Reasoner, which was a sort of leftist academic journal a new left academic journal that really became one of the core journals for publications of the New Left in Great Britain. The New Left was a product in part because of disenchantment with the status quo in both Western Europe and in the East. In some respects, some members of the New Left had been former members of, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain, and they had grown increasingly disenchanted with the Soviet bloc. De-Stalinization revealed the Soviet Union as an oppressive and brutal sort of empire, rather than the sort of, bastion of workers' rights that maybe it had been romanticized as prior. With de-Stalinization following Khrushchev's speech at the Party Congress, we see a lot of greater awareness about gulags, about massacres like the Katyn massacre, and the brutality of the Stalinist regime. We also see the Soviet Union repressing people's freedom, of course, with the crisis in Poland and Hungary in the late 50s. And then, of course, in 1968, we will see the protests in Czechoslovakia in the so-called Prague Spring, furthering the new left's disenchantment with the Soviet Empire. There's also a great deal of disenchantment with like status quo leadership. Members on both the right and the left in the United States had led the United States into war in Vietnam, and had overseen really what was seen by the New Left as an unjust war based on ideas of capitalist greed and military sort of aggressiveness on part of the United States. And so things like the Vietnam War, the Soviet Empire, this sort of old and out of touch status quo in places like France, for example. This type of thing leads to a disenchantment on the part of of students, of educators, of activists, and so forth. And it leads to the emergence of this broad social movement that we call the New Left. The New Left, it was not as coherent a movement as maybe it could have been if it was to be lastingly more effective. It had a broad array, a broad spectrum with respect to the things that members of the New Left acted for. It could be anti-war, opposition to the Vietnam War, opposition to nuclear weapons, advocacy for civil rights, women's rights, sexual rights, and so forth. And so it was a broad going movement, and it does not ultimately, as a consolidated movement, if you will, it doesn't really stand the test of time. In, like, for example, in the United States, in the way that the conservative movement, which was very much a reaction to the New Left in the 60s, the way the conservative movement sort of created more of for a period, a more consolidated movement that would really demonstrate its ascendancy in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan. Amongst E.B. Thompson, of course, Herbert Marcuse was also one of the four founders of the New Left. And of course, in the USA, in the United States, we see the so-called hippie movement led by folks like Abbie Hoffman, and of course, the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which was really the leading anti-war group for a period of time, and they organized some of the largest and most significant protests to the Vietnam War in the United States, and generally would be associated as being a sort of reform socialist movement in the United States. 1968 becomes sort of a year of protest across the world. We had massive protests in the United States following the Tet Offensive. Of course, these were really a culmination of protests that had been going on and increasing in 1967, following the so-called Stop the Draft Week protest of October 1967. Following the Tet Offensive, which began in January of 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong ally in Vietnam launched a full-scale offensive against the South Vietnamese and the United States in South Vietnam. And this, became a massive obsession of the American media as well as the people of the United States. And it really concerned a lot of Americans because a lot of Americans felt that we were about ready to be over with Vietnam, and it just showed that our policies had not been, the United States' policies had not been succeeding in Vietnam. And so you see really, really robust protests in the United States, largely anti-war. And of course, the Democratic Convention of 1968 was also sort of a culmination in the United States of these intense protests in 1968 carried out by what we might call the New Left, this broad grouping of activists and intellectuals and students. In May in France, of course, to May to June 1968, there were massive strikes that began at the University of Paris. And of course, students would barricade the streets, massive protests, and ultimately workers' protests as well. This became organized into a huge workers' protest in addition to the student protests. You see during this period of 1968 the beginning of the so-called Troubles in Ireland, which refers to the sort of low-intensity conflict fought between the Republic of Ireland and those in Northern Ireland, supported by the British. And so these are very, this is a year of protest in 1968, a year of social revolution all across Europe. In Italy, in West Germany, you see similar cases of varying degrees of protests in 1968. In Scandinavia, we see the Bastad protests, which you see pictured here in May of 1968, which was a protest in Sweden to the apartheid regimes in South Africa. So the protests of 1968 were very much a response of the New Left to what it saw as oppression and war and segregationist policies in different parts of the world. And as a result of this, you see a wide scale, not only continent-wide in Europe, but also in the United States, wide-scale protest by the New Left, largely at the general dissatisfaction of the status quo leadership and its policies that seem to ignore important social issues from the perspective of members of the New Left. Of course, in the Eastern Bloc as well, we see a very, very significant protest also in Czechoslovakia, the so-called Prague Spring, which in 1968 was organized largely because of a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia after the rise of Alexander Dubček. Alexander Dubček began a series of reforms. He was a member of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, and he was selected as leader. And when he began as leader, and some of this stuff might give you reminders of like Hungary, for example, a decade earlier, Dubček sought reforms, and these reforms included a decentralization of administrative authority, particularly democratization within Czechoslovakia. It included pushing of economic liberalization, so a pullback from the sort of planning economics of the Soviet empire, and also the division of Czechoslovakia along the lines of two new states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The Soviet Union was particularly incensed by the push towards democratization, economic liberalism, or liberalization, as it saw these a threat to the empire, that these were reforms that could signify shockwaves to other Warsaw Pact states, and might encourage reformists to take actions that could result in the fracturing of the Soviet empire. And of course, if we jumped ahead 20 years, we would realize that during the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, when Mikhail Gorbachev embraced these kinds of reforms, it was these kind of reforms that ultimately did tear the Soviet Union apart. The Soviet empire had increasingly been perceived as a repressive empire that was controlling countries and peoples against their own popular sovereignty, against their own will. And for this reason, the press towards reform in the Soviet Union could be very dangerous, or in the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact could be very dangerous, and it could signify the tendency towards independence and a fracturing of the Soviet Empire. And so particularly democratization and economic liberalization programs that Alexander Dubček proposed were particularly of concern for the Soviet Union, and this leads to an invasion of 500,000 Warsaw Pact forces. So the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's version of NATO, invades Czechoslovakia. And while it was expected to put down the protest in a matter of days, this non-military protest lasted upwards of 8 months, and protesters found numerous ways to resist the Soviet occupation, including things like turning around road signs, which in one case it said that protesters turned around the road signs in such a way that a major, I think it was a division from Poland, actually went the wrong way and went back to Poland because of the manipulation of road signs by the Czechoslovakian activists. Eventually, of course, the protest is put down and crushed. Alexander Dubček will be removed from power, but nonetheless, this was a real signifier of some of the problems with the Soviet Empire, and of the desire for those within the Soviet Empire for a greater say in their affairs, politically and economically. The division of Slovakia and the Czech Republic was the only lasting reform that was kept. So we see the emergence of Slovakia alongside the Czech Republic as a result of this. So 1968 is a really tumultuous time in the Western world. Protests in the United States to Vietnam policy and also civil rights and women's rights policies. We see mass protests across Europe, particularly in France, but also in Czechoslovakia, in Sweden, all across Europe to status quo power and status quo control. These protests are all generally nonviolent, and the reformers, by and large, seek fundamental social reforms within their given areas. And this is really the height of the New Left as a pseudo-revolutionary social movement. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful, and let's have a great week.